Hi everyone, this is Ryan Keith, your professor for general psychology. This is the second in 2 videos on conditioning. If you haven't watched the first one on classical conditioning, I'd recommend going back to take a look at it. Make sure that you're up to date on that stuff. If you feel pretty good on classical conditioning, however, feel free to just watch this one. Just like we did with the classical conditioning video, I'm going to take some time to talk about some basic things in operant conditioning. What it is, how it works, and some of the complicated words in it. Now, if you watched the classical conditioning video already, you know that we talked about one set of complex two-part terms. Operant conditioning works the same way. Many of the complex terms from operant conditioning are just two-part words, and if you understand each individual part, you can understand the whole word better. Now, before we get started with anything else, I want to make sure that we cover the basics of all conditioning, all learning. Whether we're talking about classical or operant conditioning, the focus is always on two main things: stimuli and responses. Now in this class, a stimulus is simply anything at all you can detect. That's anything in the real world that you don't do, something that you see or hear or feel or smell or taste. It could be a slice of cake, it could be a phone, it could be a light, it could be a sound, it could be a song, it could even be a person. In contrast, a response is something that you do. Usually something that you do as a result of experiencing a stimulus. So, being hungry could be a stimulus, and eating something when you're hungry would be a response. I use this example a lot, but a stoplight at an intersection is a stimulus, and you stopping at that intersection is a response. Someone asking you to do something is a stimulus, and you doing it or refusing to do it is a response. Classical conditioning was all about learning that two stimuli are related. Operant conditioning, in contrast, is about learning that stimuli and responses are related. Specifically, that in the presence of a specific stimulus, you need to give a certain response in order for something good or bad to happen. Now, just like how we always talk about Ivan Pavlov when we talk about classical conditioning, when we talk about operant conditioning, there's this guy, E.L. Thorndike, who always comes up. He always comes up in part because he developed this thing that you see up at the top of the screen called the law of effect. The law of effect underlies all of operant conditioning. And the law of effect states that if a stimulus followed by a response results in a reward, that stimulus is likely to result in that behavior in the future. Okay, so this is a really great scientific definition. It is specific, it's precise, it's full of words, but it's not always easy to remember word for word. And it's not always easy to figure out exactly what it means in a common sense way. So again, just like in the last video, I can use my dog Ruger to help us talk about this, to help us understand exactly what the law of effect means, what operant conditioning is. Here's the basics. And if you've ever trained a pet, if you've ever trained a dog, you've done operant conditioning before. So imagine I take my dog Ruger to the park. Here you can see Ruger hanging out at the park, and let's say I want to get Ruger to do something, like to bark. Well, I'm going to get Ruger really excited, I'm going to get him to the point where he's almost going to bark on his own anyway, and then just as he's about to do it, I'm going to say, Ruger, speak. And hopefully, what I'm going to get out of that is that Ruger is going to speak. And I can ask you, what do you think I should do if I ask Ruger to do something like speak, and he does it? Why, I should give him a piece of his absolute favorite turkey hot dog as a reward for doing the right thing, right? So, the law of effect pretty much states in this way, that if you tell an animal to do something, and they do it, and they get a reward for doing it, why, they're more likely to do what you want in the future. And you can imagine this doesn't just hold for animals, but for people too. There's a lot more to operant conditioning than this, but it does demonstrate the very basics of it. In this way, the focus of operant conditioning isn't learning that two stimuli go together, but that when you get a certain stimulus, like a command or a set of instructions, you should do something, because if you do that, a good thing might come along for you. Now we can move a little bit further and talk about some of the specifics of operant conditioning, some of the different ways in which we can change behavior, make it happen more or less. And to do this, we talk about another guy, a guy named B.F. Skinner. Now, B.F. Skinner, you know, is famous for developing that thing you see on the left-hand side of the screen called an operant chamber, or, appropriately, a Skinner box. But he's also famous because he did a lot of work in rats and mice and pigeons and cats and even people to identify the different ways that we can shape behavior. And this is where some of the more complex terms from operant conditioning come from, some of the ones that confuse my students more than just about anything else in the whole class. Now, kind of like with classical conditioning, there is a trick to understanding this, and the trick is this. Take everything that you know about rewards, punishments, reinforcements. Take everything you know about how you shape behavior, and I want you to just take it out of your head for a couple of minutes, and I want to put that away. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the words that make up the different ways that we can change behavior. And if you work with your common sense understanding of what these things are, you're likely to misunderstand what they mean in this setting. In this class, if we break down these terms into their smallest parts, the smallest words, they're a lot easier to understand. For example, in the most basic sense, there are two ways to change behavior. That is through either reinforcement or punishment. Now again, a reinforcement isn't necessarily what you think it is. A cupcake is not necessarily a reinforcement, and a spanking isn't necessarily a punishment. In psychology, a reinforcement is anything at all that results in a behavior happening more. A punishment, in contrast, is anything at all that results in a behavior happening less. So for example, a cupcake, a spanking, a pizza party, or a trip to Disneyland, any of these could be reinforcements or punishments, depending on what they do to certain behaviors. You can take this one step further and understand that if somebody were to ask you, for example, is a pizza party a reinforcement or a punishment? You can't really answer that question. Even if you know the behavior they're trying to change, you don't really know if something is going to be a reinforcement or a punishment until you observe what happens to the behavior. For example, there are lots of kids who act out in middle school, high school, even college classrooms. They're the class clowns. They make a lot of noise, they disrupt the classroom, and teachers respond by yelling at them, by shaming them, by sending them to the principal, or even spanking them. What they mean to do in this case is punish the behavior of acting out in the classroom. For many of these children, however, who are seeking attention, this kind of attention, it's not ideal, but it's better than nothing. Why? That fuels this bad behavior. And as a result, the getting yelled at, the being sent to the principal, the spanking and the suspension, these things are not punishments, but are in fact reinforcements. You can see in the back of the picture there my good friend Ruger, who assisted us earlier in teaching classical and operant conditioning. Now when we look at reinforcement and punishment, we can see that there are two kinds of each of these, both positive and negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishment. Now in this case, again, I need you to forget what you know about positive and negative reinforcement. Here, positive does not mean good, positive does not mean pleasant. Negative does not mean unpleasant. Negative does not mean unfortunate. Positive and negative in this case simply mean the same things that they mean in math. Positive means you add something. Negative means you remove something. So in this case, when we talk about positive reinforcement, all we mean is that we add something as a consequence of behavior that makes that behavior happen more. The same thing with negative reinforcement. Don't bother trying to think of too many examples at this stage. Just understand negative reinforcement is whenever you remove something as the consequence of behavior that's likely to make that behavior happen more. With punishment, where we're making behavior happen less, it's the same thing. Positive punishment just means you're adding something to make punishment happen, you're adding something to make a behavior happen less. With negative punishment, you're removing something to make a behavior happen less. So let's think about some examples to help illustrate this. If we think about a middle school child, for example, somebody who's about 12 years old, there's a lot of behavior that you might want to be modifying there. We could think, for example, about a behavior that you want to have happen more, like doing their homework. Middle schoolers need to do their homework. Well, it might be easy to think of something you might add as the consequence of that behavior to make it happen more. Like a classic reward. Let's say you told a middle schooler that every single time they got their homework done, they could get extra TV time or video game time. If they did all their homework for the week on time, they could go for pizza or ice cream. This is a positive reinforcement because you're introducing something like a pizza party or ice cream that is meant to make that behavior happen more. Now, again, you don't really know if it's a reinforcement until you observe the effect on behavior. If the kid hates pizza, it might not work very well as a reinforcement, for example, but in theory, these things should work. One of the key parts here is to remember, again, that we're always talking about the consequence of the behavior, something that comes after the behavior. So in contrast to a positive reinforcement, we can always look at a negative reinforcement also, where you remove something. In this case, you would remove something after the behavior, usually something that the child doesn't want in the first place. Something I would think of, I know your book talks about painkillers, but a lot of times I like to think about kids this way. And I like to think of my own upbringing. In my household, for example, for me, Saturdays were chore days. I was brought up in such a way that we were up at 6 o'clock in the morning and you were outside, weeding the garden, mowing the grass, edging the yard, tilling the garden. I even had to dig a pond one time. We pulled out stumps, things like that. You do all sorts of yard work outside. And then when you were done with that, you got a reward. As the day started to get hot, you were allowed to come inside where it was nice and cool and you could do things like clean the bathrooms and vacuum the floors and dust and mop and do the windows. So in other words, there were house chores to do also. Unless I had homework. Now, if I had homework, which is what my parents really wanted me to do, why, I could do that instead of chores. And if I finished that homework, even if I finished it early, if I finished all my homework for the weekend by, say, 10 o'clock in the morning, I was done for the day. I didn't have to do any chores at all. What my parents did is they said, if you do the thing we really want you to do, we won't make you do this other thing you don't want to do in the first place. As a consequence of me doing the thing they wanted me to do, they removed the thing I didn't want to be there. That's what makes it negative reinforcement. They took away something as the consequence of the behavior that they wanted to happen more. And you can imagine almost every single Saturday morning what I was doing as quickly as possible, trying to get my homework done. Now remember, punishment is something that we do in order to try to make a behavior happen less. You can think, for example, about a middle schooler doing something like getting in a fight that you don't want to happen. Many people try to use positive punishment in a case like this. They put the child on timeout. They might get them in trouble. They might yell at them. They might send them to in-school suspension if this happened at school. Some children even get spanked. You can use positive punishment in other ways. If a child is coming home after curfew, you can yell at them, you can lecture them, you can introduce something that is relatively unpleasant to try to convince them to not do this anymore. In contrast, we also have negative punishment, or punishment by removal. Negative punishment, like negative reinforcement, involves removing something as the consequence of behavior. An example of this would be a child who's coming home late, coming home after curfew. Let's say not in middle school, but in high school. You might take away something like their car keys, or their phone, or their TV privileges as a consequence of this behavior. Now, one of the good things you can do in a case like this is use punishment and reinforcement together. Let's say you have a high school student who's coming home late after curfew. You take away their car keys. But then you turn right around and you give them an opportunity to do the right thing. The very next weekend, give them the opportunity to go out with their friends, or you take them somewhere and you say, well, you know what? If you can follow the rules, if you can be where you need to be when you need to be there, you'll get your keys back, which would be positive reinforcement. Most of the time when we look at dogs, when we look at cats, when we look at rats and mice and pigeons and people, the training that we see going on is a complex mixture of all of these things. But the best way to try to learn these terms really is to come up with your own examples. Come up with examples of things that you don't know what kind of consequences you're using, whether it's positive, negative, reinforcement, or punishment, and try to quiz yourself on these things. As one quick aside, among the things that B.F. Skinner identified when looking at reinforcement and punishment, he identified that reinforcement simply works better than punishment. When we look at the numbers, it works a lot better for shaping behavior. And this is why your book focuses on intermittent reinforcement and schedules of reinforcement later in the chapter. And I know it might be confusing for some of you also to think about, well, if you want a behavior to happen, wouldn't it be better to just reinforce it all the time? Why not use continuous reinforcement and reinforce it every time? Well, the way I like to think about this is to think about my dog, Ruger. I train him all the time. I work with him all the time trying to convince him to be good. I give him lots of treats for doing the right thing. But you can imagine that if I reinforce him every single time for doing what I want him to do, he will come to expect a reinforcement every single time. And if we're caught somewhere on a walk, on a trip, in a store, and I need him to do something and I don't have a treat, he's going to learn pretty darn quickly that I don't have that treat and he doesn't need to listen to me. If, however, I have trained him by only giving him treats some of the time, why, if I don't have a treat when I need him to do something, he might keep on doing it because maybe, just maybe, if he does what I need him to do the next time, he's going to get a treat then. Well, hopefully this answers most of your questions about classical and operant conditioning. If If it doesn't, please feel free, send me an email, post another idea on the discussion topics, chat with me in my office hours, or even ask to talk to me on the phone. I'll be happy to. If this helps you out, that's great. Good luck on the exam next week. If not, I'll look forward to hearing from you. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Canvas. Thanks.